Do you believe that your decisions are truly your own? Or is there something, or someone, influencing your thoughts without you even realizing it? Most people like to think that they have complete control over their choices, but this is the most dangerous illusion in the social game. Invisible manipulation is not about giving orders or imposing rules. It operates at the subtle level, where the victim believes they are making decisions on their own, when in fact, they are simply following a carefully planted path. This is what happens when you choose a product without realizing that you have been convinced by marketing before you even consider buying it. Or when you advocate an idea with conviction without realizing that this idea has been gradually implanted in your mind through repetition. The most effective control comes not from force, but from suggestion. This brings us to a fundamental principle, the illusion of choice. When you give someone choices, but they all lead to the outcome they want, that person feels in control when in fact they are being guided. This is how great strategists, from politicians to CEOs of major corporations, shape society without arousing suspicion. Think about social media apps. You can post whatever you want, but the algorithm chooses what gets visibility. You can vote for whoever you want, but the candidates have been filtered by a system that has already shaped your perception before you even decide. Freedom in this game is a relative concept. What makes this manipulation so effective? The answer lies in emotions. People like to believe that they are driven by logic, but the truth is that most human decisions are emotional. Fear, euphoria, pride, and the need to belong are much more powerful forces than any rational argument. If you can associate an idea with a strong feeling, it becomes practically impossible to reject. The greatest manipulators in history understood this perfectly. They did not try to convince people with facts, but rather to make them feel. Adolf Hitler, for example, did not win over crowds with rational arguments, but with impassioned speeches that aroused fear and hope at the same time. The same thing happens with modern marketing. No one buys a cell phone because of its processor, but rather because of the feeling of belonging and status that the brand sells. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of invisible manipulation is the use of mental triggers. A classic example is reciprocity. When someone does something for you, you feel unconsciously inclined to reciprocate. Great salespeople exploit this by offering freebies or favors before presenting the real offer. Another trick is scarcity. If a product seems limited, your mind panics and the desire to have it increases. Now think about how many times you have fallen for these tricks without realizing it. When a website says that only 2 units left, you feel an urgency that was never there before. When an influencer launches an exclusive course with limited spaces, you rush to take it, even without being sure if you really need it. These triggers exploit deep weaknesses in the human psyche and are used daily in advertising, negotiations, and even in personal relationships. The question that few ask themselves is, to what extent are we really in control? Invisible manipulation operates in such sophisticated ways that even those who believe themselves to be resistant end up being influenced. The very idea that you are immune to manipulation may be a reflection of the manipulation itself, and this is the game that few realize they are playing. If there's one name that resonates when we talk about manipulation and power, it's Niccolò Machiavelli. For centuries, he was both admired and feared. His masterpiece, The Prince, is not a textbook on governance, but rather a cold, ruthless study of how to maintain power at any cost. Unlike the moralistic philosophers who debated what constituted just government, Machiavelli wasn't interested in morality. He was interested in effectiveness. For him, what mattered was not being loved or being just, but remaining in control. And his main lesson was clear. Manipulation doesn't have to be obvious to be lethal. One of Machiavelli's most controversial ideas is the famous question, is it better to be loved or feared? He answers without hesitation. It is desirable to be both, but since it is difficult to combine them, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. But be careful, he's not talking about being hated. Hatred breeds revolts and conspiracies, something a true manipulator avoids. The ideal is to be feared enough that no one wants to challenge your authority, but respected enough that they see no reason to rebel. Now think about how this plays out today. Political leaders control crowds not only through force, but through carefully planted fear. whether it's fear of the enemy, instability, or an uncertain future. In the corporate world, CEOs manipulate employees with the silent threat of replacement. In relationships, some people dominate their partners by generating a subtle fear of abandonment or rejection. Machiavelli recognized this centuries ago. Fear is a powerful psychological bond, and, if well measured, it keeps people where you want them. Another brilliant tactic described by Machiavelli is the famous divide and conquer. The idea is simple: a disunited group can never organize against you. So, to maintain control, a leader or manipulator must foster internal rivalries within the opposition itself. Think about how modern politicians use this strategy. Instead of fighting a unified group, they promote internal divisions, causing adversaries to turn against each other. Companies also use this tactic. Instead of allowing employees to unite against the boss, they create internal competitions and bonuses that make them compete against each other. The result? Everyone is too busy fighting each other to notice who is really in control. But Machiavelli didn't just describe how to manipulate. He also warned about the dangers of being manipulated. He understood that power is unstable, and that even the most skilled manipulator can be betrayed if he is not careful. No control is absolute, and those who play the game of manipulation must always be alert to the risks. History is full of leaders who fell because they underestimated their opponents or became victims of their own strategies. King Louis XVI, for example, trusted too much in the power structure of the French monarchy and ignored signs of revolt until he was guillotined. Even modern dictators who seem to have absolute control were overthrown when they lost their sense of the game. Here's the paradox: the manipulator can never relax. If you build your power on illusion and psychological control, you must always be alert to the cracks that may appear. Machiavelli knew this, which is why his strategies are not just about gaining power, they are about maintaining it. He understood that effective manipulation requires constant vigilance, strategic adjustments, and sometimes a willingness to sacrifice pawns to preserve the king. And that's the brutal truth about the game of control. If you want to rule, you have to be prepared for the psychological toll it takes. A manipulator's biggest mistake is not failing to control someone, it's being found out. Because the moment their tactics become visible, their influence crumbles. Manipulation, by definition, needs to be invisible. If someone realizes they're being played, the relationship changes completely. Trust breaks down, respect dissolves. And even worse, the person who was once a puppet can become an active enemy. An adversary who knows their weapons and now seeks revenge. This brings us to the first fundamental principle of safe manipulation: the smokescreen. If a manipulator wants to remain in control, he can never appear to be a manipulator. The most effective way to hide his game is to appear to be the exact opposite of what he really is. Think of the greatest leaders in history. The most persuasive were not those who imposed themselves through brute force, but those who appeared benevolent and charismatic. The effective manipulator is not the one who presents himself as a master of the game, but rather as a trusted friend, a guide, an advisor. The secret is to plant ideas without appearing to be leading anything. It's the art of making others believe they've come to their own conclusions. But even the most cunning manipulators run an invisible risk: the victim's behavior changing. When someone starts to realize they're being manipulated, the signs come in subtle ways. Hesitations in their responses, unexpected resistance, or even small acts of defiance. Here's a simple test. Ask someone for something they would normally accept without question. If that person hesitates or seeks justifications that weren't necessary before, it may be a sign that they've begun to sense your influence. This is the critical moment where many manipulators fail. Instead of backing off and recalibrating their approach, they double down and try to force control. And that, more often than not, leads to their downfall. Another danger that's often overlooked is the mirror effect of manipulation. The more you manipulate, the more paranoid you become. Because once you understand how the game works, you start to see manipulation in everything and everyone. Relationships cease to be authentic and become an eternal game of chess, where every word, every gesture, every expression seems to carry a hidden intention. This can lead to a state of constant vigilance and even isolation. Because when you believe that everything is a game of control, trusting someone becomes impossible. And, ironically, this is the fate of many who delve too deeply into the world of manipulation. They end up becoming prisoners of their own game. That is why the true master of manipulation is not the one who controls everyone around them all the time, but the one who knows when to manipulate and when to back off. Because manipulation cannot be a constant state. It needs to be used strategically at the right times with specific targets. Those who try to manipulate everything all the time wear themselves out and inevitably make mistakes. The game of control is not about dominating everyone around you, but about knowing which battles are worth fighting and which risks should not be taken. And, in the end, the question remains, is manipulation really power? Or is the real power in influencing without having to resort to these games? Because, in the end, even the most skilled manipulator can be manipulated back. Manipulation is a powerful tool, but like any weapon, it can backfire on the wielder. Controlling without being noticed requires strategy, patience, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The greatest manipulators in history were not only masters of influence, they also knew when to stop, when to back off, and when to let others believe they were in control. But now the question is, where do you stand in this game? Are you the player or the piece? Are you pulling the strings, or are you being manipulated without realizing it? Because the truth is that no one is ever completely in control. Even the greatest strategists end up at some point trapped in the webs they themselves have created. The real power lies not in manipulating everyone around you, but in understanding how the game works. Because when you understand the rules, you can choose how to play them. You can defend yourself, you can influence, you can observe. The danger is not in knowing how to manipulate, it is in becoming blinded by your own control. So the final big question is, if you have the ability to manipulate, should you use that power? Or is the true master the one who doesn't need this game to win? And in the end, who is really in control?